Brilliant. Welcome, everybody. If you haven't done already, please do select the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select either English or Spanish and mute original audio. This is the fourth series in the series of webinars that we're conducting on kinship care, which will be running until July or August this year. The webinars are happening in parallel to the development of global interagency guidance on kinship care, which are being led by Family for Every Child. Family for Every Child is a global alliance of 46 local CSOs in 38 countries. For a bit of background, in 2019, Family commissioned research on kinship care, which showed that this vital form of care and protection for children was being widely neglected around the world. This publication, The Paradox of Kinship Care, made a strong case for greater investment in kinship care. The guidance and webinar series now seek to demonstrate how to effectively support kinship care. If you would like to get involved in the development of the guidance, you can do so by joining the Kinship Care group on Changemakers for Children platform. We will share regular updates and opportunities to input and comment on the guidance, and we're aiming to publish the guidance in October 2023. In this webinar, we'll be looking at how support needs vary depending on the type of caregiver. The webinar will be a mixture of presentations and Q&A. So introducing our panel for today. Jess, thanks. So with us today, we have Emily Delap from Child Frontiers, who's been leading on the research and the development of the global interagency guidance. We've got Meredith Corrali, an honorary research fellow from the University of Melbourne in Australia, who's done extensive research on kinship care. And we've got Sarah Clark from Kinship in the UK, who is their Associate Director for their peer-to-peer support services for kinship carers. We're going to start today with Emily Delap giving an overview of this topic based on the findings emerging through the development of the interagency guidance. Emily, welcome.
Thank you, Gemma. So as Gemma mentioned, we've been developing this global guidance on kinship care, which has involved quite an extensive review of the literature and also discussions, key informant interviews and focus groups with those working in kinship care around the world. So what I'm presenting now is really an overview of the findings on how support needs for kinship care vary and some of the factors that affect those support needs. What I'm presenting is not really designed to be an exhaustive list of all the factors that can affect support needs for kinship care, but really just providing some examples to hopefully demonstrate that we need a nuanced and more kind of sophisticated response to kinship care that recognises that not all kinship care families are the same. Go to the next slide, please. So overall, support needs vary by all of the factors that we have listed on the screen. So by context, so for example, in emergency context, in other contexts, by the disability of the child or carer, by race and ethnicity of kinship care families, relationships between the carer and the child, the type of legal arrangement that is in the kinship care arrangement, by the age of the child, by factors such as reason for entry into kinship care, and also by social norms. We've already touched on the first of those issues in our previous webinar, which looked at issues around kinship care in the context of emergencies and across borders. And we're hoping to have a further webinar or discussion around disability in relationship to kinship care as well. But just to give you an overview, in very many contexts, there's evidence to suggest that there's higher rates of disability amongst both kinship carers and children in kinship care. And this is especially the case where kinship carers tend to be elderly and therefore suffer from more long-term health issues or disability. And we know that kinship care families affected by disability face a lot of additional challenges, perhaps in relation to poverty, maybe because carers aren't able to work, either because of their own disability or because they're caring for a child who has a disability, because of issues around stigma and social exclusion, which affect families in very many contexts, and because there are limited services for families affected by disability in a number of settings. So in terms of race and ethnicity, we know that there are, again, higher rates of kinship care amongst some groups that are discriminated against on the grounds of race and ethnicity. For example, there are higher rates of kinship care amongst African American communities in America or Aboriginal communities in Australia. And this is linked to some of the discrimination that these groups have faced, which exacerbate many of the factors which lead to entry into kinship care, such as poverty or issues around substance abuse or violence. We also know that because of discrimination, often over many decades or centuries, there can be a strong mistrust of child welfare systems amongst groups that have been discriminated against. And as a result of this, it's very important to establish relationships of trust that are based on listening to the particular needs, trying to understand their situation, and engaging these communities in responses to kinship care. So that might mean bringing them into the workforce, having them co-design programs in response to kinship care or other ways to involve them. We also know that in many cultures, there's a strong social norms around the value of kinship care and the importance of extended families and communities being involved in children's upbringing. So again, that's a real strength that can be built upon. And I think we really need to build the workforce so that they're more culturally sensitive and aware of the issues and challenges faced by particular groups, and also to expand services to reach these groups. That might be ensuring that they're not discriminated against in existing service provision or developing services that are specifically designed to meet their needs. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so I know Meredith is going to touch on this in her presentation shortly, but the needs of kinship care families vary greatly depending on the relationship between the carer and the child. So there are different challenges faced by kinship care families when the carer is a grandparent or an older sibling or an aunt or uncle or a distant relative or not related at all to the family. And there's also some evidence that there are different needs depending on whether the carer is a paternal or maternal relative and what the social norms in a particular society say about who should care for a child. So, for example, in many cultures, it's normal for the maternal relatives to care for a child. In other cultures, it's normal for paternal relatives to care for the child. And this can affect who the child is placed with and the degree of support that's open to those caregivers. In addition to these factors listed here, support needs also vary by the gender of a carer. We can see that although all of these groups face challenges, they also all bring different strengths to supporting vulnerable children. There is a tendency still, I think, for programmes to be directed or designed around the more common forms of kinship care, particularly grandparent care, which can lead to some of these other groups being left out. Okay. So finally, there are some other variations to consider. So in terms of legal arrangements, in many higher income contexts, there tend to be a number of different forms of formal kinship care alongside the informal arrangements made within a family. Although it's really widely argued that support should be based on the needs of the carer and the child, rather than the form of kinship care that the child is in, this generally isn't happening, and there tends to be more support directed towards particular forms of formal kinship care. So, for example, in many contexts, if the kinship carer is a foster carer and part of the foster care system, they'll get more support than other forms of formal kinship care. In terms of the age of the child, there are obviously huge differences depending on the age of the child, but there's quite interesting literature around adolescents in kinship care and evidence showing that adolescents in kinship care have higher rates of sexual risk-taking and child marriage in some contexts. And there are also issues around their behaviour and disciplining, but also adolescents really contributing to kinship care households, perhaps playing a very supportive and caring role to an elderly caregiver. So both challenges and benefits of having adolescents in kinship care. And reasons for entry into kinship care: it's likely that children who've entered kinship care because parents have migrated for work have very different experiences and sets of needs to children who've experienced abuse and entered kinship care because their parents have been abusive. And similarly, in terms of social norms, it's a very different experience if a child is growing up in kinship care in a context where it's very common for children to be in kinship care, where perhaps most of their peers or a substantial proportion of their peers are also spending part of their childhood in kinship care. And it's very widely socially acceptable and seen to be a normal part of childhood. Then in other settings, which are usually in higher income contexts, where kinship care is less socially acceptable and seen as something that happens when something's gone wrong in the family rather than a kind of normal part of childhood. So hopefully that's given a good brief overview, and I'll hand back over to you, Gemma. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily, for this really useful introduction to the topic. We look forward to exploring some of these areas in more depth during both this webinar and the interagency guidance. I'd now like to introduce Sarah, who will be sharing with us examples of how Kinship in the UK have tailored some of their support to caregivers depending on the type of caregiver. Over to you, Sarah. Sarah, sorry. I think you need to be on the English channel because I think you might just be on the general one. So at the bottom of your screen, there's an interpretation button. So it's like a little globe. And if you select that, you can choose English or Spanish.
Is that better?
Let's see. Try again.
Okay. Shall I start from the top?
Yes, please. Thank
Apologies.
you. That's perfect.
Apologies.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm from the charity Kinship, and we are an England and Wales charity that support kinship carers no matter what their order or arrangement might be. And since last January, we have been running a peer-to-peer support service for kinship carers across England, following a competitive tender from the Department for Education, who acknowledge that kinship carers need more support, which includes peer support according to their specific characteristics. Next slide, please. So there's some beautiful pictures on the right-hand side of some of the kinship carers that we have been bringing together geographically. There are over 200 peer support groups across England, which kinship carers can join. They're designed in all kinds of different ways. And our job has been to add to those, as well as develop specific provision to help kinship carers according to the age and stage of their journey, or according to specific characteristics that they or that their children may have. So the funding we have lasts for 2 years, and our goal is to set up 150 peer support groups, which will include online and face-to-face provision. And as of today, we're at 73 groups, so we're moving along very nicely in line with our targets. And we want to train volunteers so that groups can become sustainable, and upskill and build resilience in those groups so they can tackle the everyday challenges that kinship carers might bring to them, as well as support them in a way that's meaningful and helpful to those kinship carers who very often feel isolated and unsupported by their local authority, particularly under particular care orders or informal or private arrangements where they may not get any help at all. In addition to that, we're operating 20 free online workshops every month, and we co-produce those workshops under high demand topics, which sometimes cover specific characteristics, such as when the child is maybe behaving in quite a challenging way, right through to managing contact with birth parents. And those are running very regularly with brilliant uptake, so I can talk more about them if we have time. We also have an online chat function, so that's where you have an instant messenger and you can ask questions in a live way. And we also have Quorum, who are a well-known children's charity who do evaluation work, and they've been working with us to help us through a process evaluation over the last year. Next slide, please. So in January this year, we launched Kinship Compass, which is a brand new co-produced website to help kinship carers navigate to what they need, regardless of the age or stage of the journey that they're at. So you can see some tabs at the top, and there's a link at the end of these slides, which you'll be able to go and have a look at. So you can see how we've built and designed this website to help kinship carers find what they need. And as part of that, if you go on to the next slide, we have developed a peer support group finder where you can put in your postcode, or equally you can look for an online group, which might be a category specific to something you're interested in talking about. So here I put in Newcastle, and you can see a screenshot. It describes those groups as being in person, who the leader is, and if you were to click on one of those, you could find out when and how often they meet, and whether or not children can come, and who's running it. So it's great to have that peer finder, and as part of that we have online groups. So if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that we've been developing special interest groups which meet online via Zoom. So when we started to co-produce these sessions sort of last summer, you can read a couple of the quotes on there. We had a 36-year-old single gay man who was raising his nephew, and was yet to find anybody to whom he felt a sense of belonging. We started a men-only group in October 2022, and one of our brilliant volunteers has put a tweet on there, and you can read how eye-opening it has been for some of those people who've maybe been going on to more mainstream support groups, but have felt like their specific needs perhaps haven't been met. There's a quote from an aunt who, from the top right-hand corner there, so you can see we're trying to attract volunteers to come forward. Lots of kinship carers have a lot on their plate. So volunteer recruitment can be challenging, but they very much like coming along. And once we started our first special interest groups, we started to get more requests. So the quote in the bottom right-hand corner there for grandparents, which of course is a broad topic in itself, and I'll talk about that a little bit more and how we've broken that down. So really fascinating insights coming through from those men's group. We heard stories of men in tears, men so grateful to have an evening group that they could get to, because very often they were still working. We heard a story of a man who was forced to cook a meal from scratch in front of his social worker to prove that he would be able to provide for that child. And he sort of said, if I was a woman, I don't think this would have happened to me. And it was a very humiliating experience. So for men to be able to talk to each other, particularly single men who don't have a female adult in the house helping in any way, has been deeply, deeply helpful for that group. And they've met once a month online in the evenings, and will continue to do so. If you go to the next slide, please. There's another quote from another man on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side, we're going to show a 1-minute video, this is a group, another special interest group that we've set up for young carers, and we've further developed this as the time has gone on. So the video does have subtitles, but they're not brilliantly written even in English. So I think we're going to send out the link to YouTube should you should you like to listen and watch it later on in a different language. But we'll play it because you do get the sense of the power of the impact that it's had on this young kinship carer.
Hello, I've just done the support group with Kinship, and oh my God, it's the best thing I've ever done. I can't believe it's taken me 6 years to do something like that. Hearing other people who are kinship, so some were special guardians and some were kinship foster carers, but we were all young, some young, under 35, but most of us were looking after like nieces and nephews. And it was just amazing to just hear everybody else, just we talked about like the financial struggles, emotional struggles, how it impacts the dynamics of your family. It was the best thing I've ever done. So if you're becoming a kinship carer or already are one, look at what support groups are there for you, because I'm just so proud to be a kinship carer now and just amazed by all the stories that
So you can see from that video that the power of joining and finding other people who are in your unique situation is really quite a powerful feeling for those kinship carers. And in that particular group, we had examples of young people, so under 35, who had begun to take difficult decisions, such as, I'm now not going to have my own children because I'm looking after my nieces and nephews as if they were my own children. My career is on hold. You know, those circumstances are very, very different to such as grandparents, for example, or perhaps men only. So the importance of enabling kinship carers to have those discussions that are deeply personal and deeply relevant has come through really strongly for us in our learning. Next slide, please. So on the right-hand side, you can see another screenshot from Kinship Compass, our website, and you can see some of the groups that are advertised there now. So the groups we have already up and running are groups for older grandparents, single kinship carers, and we mean people who are raising children by themselves. Men, we have an LGBT plus group, an aunts and uncles group, and an under 35s group. And I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about our learning and what we're finding as we advertise this and kinship carers are starting to come forward. Some of the trends and behaviours are happening much as you might expect them to, but we're also getting lots of surprises as we move along as well. So coming up this year, we've got looking after younger children. So Emily mentioned that earlier, you know, it's very, very different raising babies or young children as opposed to looking after teenagers. And some kinship carers specifically want to talk about those issues, whether it be digital safety versus finding a school. You know, it's a very different dynamic. Another group we're going to open this year is a diverse kinship camp families, and we need to do a bit more work on the language here, but what we mean is if you're bringing together a family for the first time where perhaps there's differences in ethnicity or big cultural difference, how do you go about that? So we've done some work in Bromley in London with courses for kinship carers who are raising dual heritage children. Very, very often it's a white kinship carers who are raising dual heritage or black and ethnic minority group children, and they want to do the right thing, but they're not too sure what to do, or they can't find a hairdresser, or they're not sure how to celebrate the other part of the family who perhaps has less involvement in the child. So we're developing a group just for that, for those people, because we know there's a big need there. We're also developing a group that we're calling Kinship Care on a Shoestring, because we know around half of the kinship carers who come to our groups are struggling financially. That's what they tell us. So how to get cheap deals, where you can get vouchers, what financial help you might be entitled to, you know, days out, that kind of thing. And then another one on surviving the school holidays, which we know is a big topic for kinship carers. If you're caring by yourself and you've got 5 or 6 weeks looming before you through the summer, how am I going to cope with this? What might be the tips and tricks to keeping the children off their devices or out or seeing family, or keeping the rhythm and ritual that means a lot to them going? And then we've had 2 topics that we've tested, and we're going to do more this way, that we've developed into a 6-week series, which has again been peer support, but led with real professional and expert input. And one of those has been around bereavement. So what we mean by that is kinship carers who have probably become a kinship carer because of the bereavement of their child. So very often this happens in, with a grandparent situation. I was talking to a kinship carer in a Nottingham cafe yesterday, and her daughter had died very recently, just at the end of last year, and the children had come to stay with her, most unexpectedly and for the first time. So that's a very unique and different situation to grandparents who may be looking after children because of prison or because of substance misuse, and they may have contact, and there's a whole set of contextual factors that need to be considered. And then we're going to do another 6-week series on Lost, the life I left behind, helping kinship carers process the life they expected to have, and they may well have parked that in order to make sure the children's needs have been met. But it's important to give those kinship carers their own space to talk about the retirement I won't get, or the career I've lost, or the friends that have left me behind, because I'm now in this unplanned role that I didn't expect to be in. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of quotes there that you can perhaps read when you get the slides later, but this sort of brings us into our learning section. So that the quote on the left-hand side there, this was a lady who's come to our older grandparents group, and she's 61. So a lot of us wouldn't say 61 is an older grandparent, but she's taking on a baby for the first time. So for her, she felt like she self-identified as an older grandparent and has come along to that. And then just a quote on the bottom left, which we found really, really powerful. Kinship carers coming to multiple things that kinship have offered and telling us that we've helped them get through their darkest days, which is really wonderful to see. Next slide, thank you. So we've learned an awful lot in this last 6 months, you know, taking kinship carers to coffee mornings, doing things for the first time, and you can see a little board there. The online versus face-to-face offer is a tricky one, and we're still grappling with that as we continue to scale the service. We know digital accessibility and digital training are an issue, but we also know that transport and getting out to venues can be challenging for others. So we don't for a moment think that we've got this all stitched up to perfection, but it is worth considering how you're going to deliver peer support or deliver training or any kind of emotional or factual information that kinship carers are going to access. For our online groups, we ask people to register beforehand so we know who's going to come. And we're learning a lot about registration versus attendance. And as you'd imagine, attrition can be quite high with kinship carers. It only takes a child to be poorly or something unexpected to happen, and of course they can't come along. And we're learning lots about days of the week and time of day that tends to attract the different audiences. I mentioned earlier that the men's group are doing very well on an evening. We know that grandparents tend to do better during the day when perhaps the children are at school. And bedtime is to be avoided. We find that reminders really help people. We send out a text if they've registered for something, and we do find that drives up numbers. Of course, we don't penalise if people don't manage to come along, and all of our services are free and open access. So we just build and design the services, understanding what those kinship carers' lives are like and giving them every opportunity to come back to us when the time is right for them. Volunteer recruitment is always a challenge, and anybody knows anything about volunteering more widely in the UK, and I expect across the world, post-pandemic volunteer recruitment has become more challenging. And volunteers or anybody who's going to give up their time expect more informal roles and more flexibility, just like the paid workforce has begun to expect. So we're trying our best to flex and make sure that our volunteering opportunities are as accessible and easy for people to come along to. But we do have to balance that, of course, with safeguarding and GDPR and making sure our kinship carers are safe and well looked after when they come and enjoy our services. So sustainability, we've got the rest of this year to think about that. Many of our groups are now sustainable. We know not all of them will be, and we'll have to work out the best possible formula for keeping these groups going as our funding, as it stands, come to an end. Although, of course, we will seek further funding. Group size is another interesting dynamic. I've seen groups of 2 or 3 who have very, very deep and meaningful conversations, particularly when they're with kinship carers with whom they have something specifically in common. So I guess my message there is it's sometimes funding and funders and leaders that are still very, very focused on numbers and volume. But we continue to see really, really high impact conversations, and some of our strongest evaluation has come from some of those smaller group sizes where kinship carers are able to have really, really relevant and personal conversations that move them forwards. As an example there on the right-hand side of a kinship carer who stumbled across grants that she was eligible for that nobody had told her about. And you can't find those things out unless you're in a small group and having quite an intimate conversation with 1 or 2 other people about their unique experience. And finally, to finish, we've done some work with Quorum this year. So they've done an evaluation for us, which has been wholeheartedly positive. Lots of learnings and recommendations, and we're hoping to publish that next month. So do look out for it if you're interested. And the next slide, please, is my penultimate, the one just about workshops, which I won't talk about. It's a little bit out of scope for today. But we have got a whole range of 1-hour workshops which are online, which again gives kinship carers specific information. There's one there about SEND and EHCP. So if you have a child with additional needs, what do you do? Where do you go? One on challenging behaviour, which has been particularly popular with kinship carers raising teenagers, or where there's additional needs in terms of trauma and attachment. The next slide is by a kinship child who has created that lovely poster to help us promote one of our brand new groups in Cheshire East, being raised by her aunt there, and is really supportive of her aunt getting support that she needs. And the final slide is some links there for how you can help. So if you are based in the UK or England and Wales, there's a couple of links that you can go and have a look at. And I guess my parting messages are try and embrace the variety of ways that seem to be working. There certainly isn't a one size fits all, but there can be a one size fits no one, I would say, in kinship care. So be deliberate and try to work with those kinship carers that you know and co-produce together. And I think building a local ecosystem for us has been key. So understanding where there's partners and signposting and others who might be able to help you has been a major ingredient that's helped us move forward. So don't underestimate the rest of the sector and the community who can help you with this work. That's it from me, Gemma, hopefully on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been great to hear those examples of how this could be done in practice. Now, unfortunately, Sarah won't be here for the Q&A section of today's webinar. So if you do have any specific questions around the work of kinship, please do share them via the chat or the Q&A now, and Sarah might be able to respond to them before she needs to leave. Otherwise, we will have a mechanism for following up with her afterwards as well. So I'd now like to welcome Meredith Corrali. As mentioned, Meredith has done extensive research on kinship care and will also be able to share with us about the Australian context. Meredith, welcome.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Now, do I need to
move that slide?
Okay. All right. So I'm just in the UK for a few days at the moment, and quite honoured really to be invited to speak at this webinar. And I'll just introduce myself a little bit first, except those slides aren't moving. Hang on. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're right. Yep, okay. All good, thanks. So my background is that I worked in child welfare for a long time before I moved into research, and what you're seeing here is just the front covers of some of the reports I've done around kinship care. Starting off, I was looking at family contact, so contact between children in kinship care and their parents, or indeed other members of their family. And from that, I really then moved into looking at diverse groups of kinship carers, in particular looking at young kinship carers and non-familial kinship carers, those family friends carers that get sort of lumped in with the family. The one in the middle, the cover there is, this is my most recent project, which has been around young kinship carers. And I have to say, quite a lot of my work has been inspired by what's happened in the UK. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So just to revisit the definition that we use, which is from the United Nations, which encompasses both the extended family and close friends of the family known to the child, whether formal or informal in nature. Now, this is just a quote from one of the young lads who was involved in the early work I did around family contact. Just really, I think it sums up quite nicely one of the strengths, key strengths really, of kinship care, that for this boy, he really felt that this was just another way of being in his family. It didn't seem weird or strange to me, he said. Paul Nixon, a British researcher, did a broad sweep of the literature some years ago, identified some of the overwhelming findings about placements being more stable than foster care, at least as safe, and the contact between children and their families. And I think importantly, their brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, the other grandparents, if they're with grandparents, and the wider family is something that comes up in kinship care a lot more than any other form of out-of-home care. These are contacts sometimes that we tend to forget about. We think about contact with the parents, but we forget how important it can be for children to know their cousins, for example, their aunts and uncles. And these are contacts that are often lost when a child goes into foster care. Is that turning over? No, yes. Okay, just a little bit of context about where I come from. So Australia is huge, nearly the size of Europe, which has obvious implications for delivery of services. A small population relative to other countries. Most people living around the eastern seaboard. Excuse me. We have an Indigenous population of around 1 million people, and a high immigrant population. And what we have a federated government, so by which I mean that there's two main tiers of government, that is the Commonwealth government and state by state government, which raise a number of complexities in relation to the way child protection is managed and where informal kinship care sits. First Nations people are very diverse among themselves. The Aboriginal nations have many different languages and histories, and complex forms of kinship, which are different in different communities. Torres Strait Islanders are racially and culturally different. They're Melanesian people, so they're closer to, in culture, to the people of Papua New Guinea, to the north of us, and they have their own forms of cultural adoption. Indigenous children in Australia are highly overrepresented, and this is basically due to a fairly shameful history of dispossession, forced removal of children, and modern practice. We now recognise that it is critical for these children to remain connected to family, culture and community if they're to thrive. But we've still got a long way to go to ensure that that happens. So I've identified two main pathways to kinship care, and this would be broadly similar in many countries, I think, where through child protection, children end up in what we call formal kinship care. I think in the UK, it's known as kinship foster care, or one of the special guardianship pathways, where monitoring and sometimes support takes place and a care allowance is paid, or the informal pathway, which is usually organised by the family themselves and attracts very little support of any sort. In fact, it's not quite as clear-cut as that. Sometimes child protection's involved, but they choose not to formalise a placement. Sometimes an informal arrangement for one reason or another becomes a formal placement. But what we do know, and really thanks to work done in the UK by Julie Selwyn and her colleagues initially, is that most kinship arrangements are informal, and yet a lot of the focus is placed on the child protection arrangements. And the biggest problem is financial stress. Okay, just looking at the groups in a different way, so we can see that informal kinship care is a much bigger component than formal kinship care. Grandparent care is a large part of it, but by no means the whole story. Okay, so now I just want to look at some of the different relationships. We think grandparents are the largest group. We're not really sure. Census data in the UK indicated that there were about half, and I suspect that's true of Australia, but our census data isn't as easily accessible as it is in the UK. So we're still waiting for better data to be sure. Aunts and uncles, older sisters and brothers, and I've just put all the others, and we'll have a look at who they are. So, yeah, there's so many diverse arrangements in kinship care, and some of these really get lost in the narrative. Most of the pictures on these slides just come off the internet, publicly available, but this picture I've put there because this brings back a happy memory for me, sitting beside a lake talking to a very young kinship carer who has ended up looking after her male cousin's daughter, and then a couple of years later the mother of that child had a second child, so this one's not genetically related to her, but there they are. And we sat there and she suggested the children they roll up their leggings so that they didn't get wet, and you can see what happened. They ended up in the water with the other kids and got thoroughly wet and had a thoroughly good time. But you get all these relationships that are not talked about very much, you know, and I've talked to hundreds of kinship carers now, and situations like this where you've got the ex-husband's ex-wife, the ex-husband's ex-wife's ex-husband's stepmother's father's sister, all these different arrangements that come up. And yet we do tend to think of this group as grandparents. So these are just some of the things you can pull off the internet about grandparent groups. And I think Kinship Care Charity in the UK has been very far-sighted in changing their name from their original name, which was Grandparents Plus. And it would be great, I think, to see more of these organisations think about a name that's a bit more inclusive. This was really what started me off on this journey, was looking at the work of Julie Selwyn and her team in Bristol, looking at what data could be extracted from the British census. And they discovered, to their surprise, that as well as grandparents, was really a high proportion of sibling kinship carers. Around the same time, the Family Rights Group, also based in London, did a qualitative study looking at sibling carers. And this was what I wanted to do. As it turned out, I'm getting ahead of myself, I'll come back to that. So this was some of the findings of Selwyn and Nerndy. That is a very high proportion of sibling kinship carers. Now, they've reviewed those figures with the subsequent census, and the figures have dropped a bit, but nevertheless, there are still a lot of sibling carers in the United Kingdom. A lot of them were young women, and a lot of them were single, and many had no qualifications. Mostly caring for more than one, significant amounts of overcrowding and poverty. And one of the articles that this team wrote actually concluded by suggesting that it would be desirable to look at this pattern and see whether there's a similar pattern in other countries, where the reasons for becoming a kinship carer are similar to those reporting studies of grandparent carers, and to uncover what sibling carers' particular circumstances and needs might be. This is where I started. However, so as I've alluded to, it's not, no,
Is that the right one?
let's just have a look. Next one after that. That's it, okay. As I've alluded to, we weren't able to pull out the relationship data from the census, so I looked at I moved to looking at age related, and that was where I ended up looking at young kinship carers rather than siblings. All right, going back to looking at the grandparent group, because we do think they're the largest group, and remembering that they're not all grandparents either. There are great grandparents there are great aunts and great uncles. I think these are the issues we're most familiar with, the issues of ageing and kinship care, that health issues surface, poverty, the feelings of grief and guilt about, you know, I must have raised my daughter badly so that because she's unable to raise her own children or she's gotten into drugs and so on. The pressures, because they will tend to take on multiple children. They don't want to see their grandchildren separated. And we discovered in the work we did initially that quite often they're looking after someone, an adult with problems as well. It might be a chronic health issue. Sometimes grandparents are actually still looking after their own parents. So you might have a woman, for example, who's in, say, in her 60s, and she's got responsibility for an aging parent of her own, as well as her grandchildren. Or she's got a husband who's very ill. Difficulties with assisting children with their schoolwork, because things have changed over the generations, or they didn't have much schooling themselves, these sorts of issues. This is a quote from one of the people who responded to a survey that I did around family contact. It's damn hard because we get very tired, we have no respite. So, as I say, I think these are the issues that we're most aware of, is the issues for older carers, and the support that they need in relation to health issues, issues of fatigue, issue of large groups of children, and of course poverty. Aunts and uncles are a group that really nobody has much looked at in terms of research. When I wrote up the work I did on young kinship carers, I went looking for research around aunts and uncles, and I found one article in from the United States around black aunts, and that was it. They vary widely in age. Some of them are very young, so many of them came into the group that I was looking at of age 30 and under, often looking after their own children at the same time, and trying to balance employment with caring for children and dealing with all those issues when children are young in your family, schooling, housing, cost of living. So the picture on the right there is a picture, this is a real life one, that all those bottles come from a young woman who was in our study. She was raising her a baby and toddler of her own when her husband's sister gave birth to her 6th child, the other 5 being spread around the paternal family. And this paternal family was running out of options. So this couple said, well, how hard can it be for us? We're doing babies anyway, we'll take on another one. 1 year later, the 7th child was born and they took that one on as well. So they found themselves with 4 infants. So they had 4 on bottles, 3 in nappies, and they were dealing with developmental delays in the kinship children as well. She's now finished her social work degree. She put on hold for a few years. She's a qualified social worker, and she did a couple of keynote speeches for us, wrote an article, so she's done very well. Thank you. Right. Okay. The siblings, this is another real life story. Laura on the right, raising her sister Natalie. Laura's an intensive care nurse in the children's ward, the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. And I think the issues that they presented in an article that was written up in a local paper in Australia, and Laura was also on panels and spoke out very well, very typical of the issues of siblings. Education, employment interruptions, poverty. working out the relationships with their own parents. And in their case, that wasn't an issue because this was a case of bereavement of both parents. But in other situations, you find that within child protection, sometimes these young people are actually expected to manage contact with the children's parents. So you imagine trying to do that when you're actually one of the kids yourself. You're trying to deal with a mother who's quite disturbed, but you're her daughter. And you may be raising your own children. This was a quote from one of the people that we spoke to. She said, I don't think they realise there's so many restrictions when you take on their kids. I don't think they understand how much it costs to look after a child. You can't go to work, it makes you feel lonely. Our lives are put on hold. And this was a comment from Laura, I think. I was unprepared for how much emotional support all of us would need. We ran a co-design workshop with 10 of these young people, and these were the comments they gave us. So some of the specific needs of young kinship carers, and you'll see some of these cross the age range, some of their needs are universal, but recognition that it's different for young people, recognising that they're actually just moving into adulthood themselves and prematurely moving into parenting, that they frequently putting their education or employment on hold, so that you've got this risk that they might be trying to train for something, but are they going to be able to finish that? Is that going to jeopardise their own futures all the way through adulthood because they're not qualified? And financial assistance, which comes up over and over again. These are young people usually who are starting in adult life with no money whatsoever. And then they're taking on other people's children, and particularly if they're informal carers, hugely burdened. The non-familial kinship carers, these are the ones in the UK, I think they tend to be called family friends. A very diverse group. I think typically we might think about the friend of the family, the godmother, and so on. But in fact, when I did research around this group, they just seem to be incredibly diverse. And I coined the term fake kin because I found certainly in Australia, sometimes child protection will drop a kid with somebody who knows them a little bit and say, look, can you look after them for a few days while we sort this problem out? And that might be the placement. And it'll stay like that until it breaks down. My interest in this came out of doing a survey where a number of people rang up and said, I don't know why this came to me. I'm not actually a kinship carer. And they didn't realise that they'd been labelled a kinship carer because they thought of themselves as foster carers because they weren't actually related. But again, it was someone in the UK who really inspired me to think about this group, pointing out that there's been very little literature around this group. They tend to be thought of as just another variation on grandparent care. I did find 2 studies that identified that these placements do tend to break down at a rate that's a bit more like foster care than kinship care. And so really they do need a bit more special attention. And certainly where I live, kinship care is being used very heavily by child protection these days. And we're getting the impression that when child protection can't drop the children with the grandparents, then they are looking to anybody and everybody and calling it kinship care. So a common one would be the parent of a friend from school, particularly with a teenager. A kid might come home from school and say to mum, look, my mate, he's got nowhere to stay tonight. Can he stay for a few days? And child protection will come in and say, we'll give you an allowance. And that might be as far as it goes. And as I say, sometimes it'll break down, sometimes it won't. But the assessment of those arrangements can often be hit and miss. 5 minutes. Okay, let's just see. No, it's okay. I think we'll make it. So this again is a real life family. This was this woman's relationship. Her marriage had broken down, but these children that came into her care were her ex-husband's grandchildren. She didn't know them very well, but she took them into a household that was 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, where she already had her son and daughter and her daughter's little boy. And somehow they managed their way through all of that, and that's a bunch of them there. But yes, we certainly discovered there are care workers, youth workers, teachers, so many different people ending up in this situation of non-familial kinship care. Neighbours, a common one. But with very different needs for support, so that they found that child protection often didn't really recognise that their role was different from a grandparent. The relationships with the child's family, with the child's parents, are going to be very different. Sometimes those relationships work better because there isn't the complexity of intrafamilial dynamics. Sometimes they don't work very well because the child's family is just not very engaged with the carer, is seen as an outsider. And often they lack the history of the child. So you get these sort of comments from them. It could be you get asked at the doctors, is this a hereditary problem? And you say, well, I don't know really, I couldn't tell you. Or when they were little, did they have such and such? Did they have measles or whatever? I don't know that. You haven't got the history. And another comment was they think that you're kin, they think you're related, that you're involved in the family. But in fact, you have your family, they have theirs. So you don't have that support and the kids don't either. So a very, very different situation, much closer to foster care, really. I think it's critical that for placements like this, there must be a strong pre-existing relationship. It's not enough just for a child to be dropped into a family that vaguely knows them. And I would prefer to see children in these situations have their arrangements assessed as for foster care. This is not something that's happening in Australia. Certainly, we need to be aware that these carers need more information about the child's history and family. They need support in their relationship with the child's parents, and they need social support and breaks. And so overall, I think it really comes back to recognising that the specific nature of the relationship is at the heart of it. Each case is different. We really do need to get the data about the relationships between children and their carers by the census or by other means, so that we really know what the numbers are in our communities. And so we can stop sort of assuming that it's all grandparents and really know who these carers are. With Indigenous children, we really need to pay more attention to ensuring that the care is culturally appropriate and that those children, that their care arrangements are determined in consultation with elders and ensure connection. So that one of the risks in Australia is that where a family is of mixed heritage, the child tends to end up in the white side of the family, losing contact with their culture. And recognising the impact of poverty, which goes across the board, I think, into all relationships in kinship care. So the more casework and social and financial support that can be brought to bear, the better, really, in terms of the life opportunities for the child. We need some agreed language so that we're in different countries, we're using different language for kinship care, and even across Australia, we call things differently in different states. Carers of all relationships need to know more about the impact of trauma on children. This is not just a case of raising children, it's raising children who've suffered trauma and can be unpredictable and challenging. And we really need an inclusive approach to support services so that we recognise all these different forms of care that come under the umbrella of kinship care. So I love this quote. This is from someone who filled out the survey I did at the beginning of my work in kinship care. and said it seems to be the Cinderella of the care system. So I hope your research might help these people. And this is really what's led me into advocacy, because we want to make sure that research in this field actually makes a difference. There's a few references. You may recognise that face. He's a lot older now, and he wasn't President of the United States when that photo was taken with his grandmother, for sure. But evidence that children in kinship care can do very, very well in life if they get the right opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Your research really highlights the need to consider the diverse needs amongst the wider range of caregivers, and also the real need for more data. I'm sure this is helpful for practitioners whilst considering some of the support programs to understand the specific needs of different groups. So thank you very much, Meredith, for making the time and sharing your extensive knowledge on these things. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists today for joining and for sharing their extensive knowledge and experience on this issue. I'm now going to open up for questions. As mentioned, Sarah isn't on the webinar anymore, but please do still share questions for Kinship, as we do have a mechanism for sharing these on with her and getting responses through the Changemakers for Children platform. So please do use either the Q&A box or the comment section and share your questions for the panelists. Many thanks.
Would you like to ask one question? I'm just wondering. But just
So
there was one question that Sarah's answered. I'm just checking with Meredith whether she might want to add to that.
So,
agreed. Yeah. Shall I read it out? So
Yeah.
yes,
the
please.
question that's come through so far is, I'm curious to know if formalising kinship care impacts the motivation of carers in taking children into their care, or the spirit of family life.
Yes, I'll just read Sarah's response first. Finding in the UK, kinship care comes about in a crisis, so all too often carers don't have time to plan or prepare. Often the child is with them before a legal order is granted, so have time to plan. If they know they'll be taking a child from birth, for example. I don't think the motivation changes, but I don't know of any research around it. Anecdotally, kinship carers are driven by love and wanting to do the right thing no matter what comes with it. They don't want the children they love to go into care. I think I'd agree with Sarah's comments. I don't think it formalising a placement really, I'm not sure whether Meninda is thinking that it might reduce their motivation, do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think there is some evidence that if people are pushed into a formalised relationship and they have some resistance to that can kind of put people off perhaps being in kinship care arrangements, because they may have good reasons why they don't want that relationship to be formalised. They may have a mistrust of the social welfare system based on like discrimination, and so it can be off-putting to them, whether it actually stops them from being kinship carers or it's just something that makes them upset or reluctant to kind of engage with social services. I'm not sure, but I think it's certainly, I think the evidence shows that we shouldn't be pushing people into all kinship carers into formalised arrangements, because it's just not suitable for all of them, and it's not something that all of the kinship care families want.
For Australians, it's a real two-edged sword. I mean, actually, for Australian kinship carers, they don't really necessarily have the option to say, well, I would like to become formalised. It's up to child protection whether they formalise the placement or not. But one of the things the dilemmas that in Australia is that the money comes with formalisation. And so there are numbers of kinship carers who would, they may or may not really want child protection involved in their lives, but they're really struggling to do it without financial support. And so they may want the placement to be formalised in order to obtain financial support. This is a real challenge, and I think across the world, it's been recognised that financial support should really follow need rather than legal status. New Zealand, I think, is the only country I know of that has achieved this. So any child in New Zealand who's in kinship care for reasons of parental incapacity can receive an allowance that's equivalent to a foster care allowance. They don't have to become foster carers to do that. And that would be my dream for Australia, that eventually we achieve that, where we have an allowance for any child who's not supported financially by their parents. But while it's linked to child protection, it is a problem for many people who don't want to be part of the child protection system.
I think South Africa is quite an interesting. I'm just going to move over a little tiny bit.
Yeah,
South Africa is quite an interesting example as well. So South Africa has had for many years a foster care grant, and kinship carers, to access that grant, have to be registered as foster carers, which means they have to be assessed by social workers and regularly monitored by social workers. And this has kind of overwhelmed the whole child protection system, because there's so many kinship carers in South Africa that foster care, that social workers are spending their entire time registering, monitoring these kinship carers. So it's had a sort of detrimental effect on the wider child protection system, because social workers don't have time to investigate child abuse cases or instances, you know, where families might need more intensive support, because they're so busy registering these kinship carers so that they can become foster carers to receive the grant. But they've just, in the last, recently, over the last year, I think, or so, they've introduced a kinship care grant, which will, to address this problem, because they're recognising it as an issue, which means they won't have to go through those hoops of becoming formalised caregivers, and they can still receive that financial support. Yeah.
Thanks both. Another question's come in. What is the impact on the child if carers are not trained on basic child growth and development?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, I guess it depends a bit on what the child, what the carer brings to the situation in terms of their own experience of parenting. That they are very disadvantaged if they have no prior experience and little knowledge of child growth and development. But I would stress even more than that, the impact of a lack of knowledge about the impact of trauma, because raising a child who hasn't been traumatized is one thing that can be challenging enough for all of us, raising children at times. But then raising a child that's been traumatized is a very different thing. And I think this is really something that's essential for all kinship carers, is to have access to information about why children do the odd and frustrating and distressing things that they do after they've been traumatized, and how to handle that.
Yeah, I'd say that what Meredith is saying really illustrates the need for us to be really careful in terms of how what you might call parenting supports are offered to kinship carers, because their needs may be quite different in terms of the fact that they're working with a traumatized child, but also they may find it a bit patronizing to be told that they need parenting support when they're a grandparent and they've raised their own children,
Exactly.
and they're raising their grandchildren as well. So it's kind of, you have to deliver it very carefully, I think. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that having real kinship carer-led programs are really beneficial, where they're identifying what help that they think they need and the dilemmas that they're facing, and kind of primarily exchanging information between one another, rather than being told from some outsider about how they should be parenting. And, you know, getting that support when it's needed, but primarily learning from one another. I think that's kind of more successful.
Yeah, I'd really second that. I know a lot of Australian carers, particularly the grandparent group, would resent the idea of you need training, but they are likely to be much more open to the notion of information sessions that they can access as they need them.
Oh, it's really interesting.
I think there's a comment in the chat box which is seconding your point about the need to work with traumatized children, and understanding how to work with traumatized children. I think that's very that's maybe something we'll look into in the future, Gemma, how we can do that.
Yeah, I agreed. There's another question that's come in here from Eric. I have he joined the session late, but what model should be used when social protection programs do not support child support in kinship care arrangements for families that are income stressed and hard up?
Okay, so how should social protection be delivered for kinship? Do you want me to get that? What have you got?
I'll let you have a go at that one first. I'll come in on your questions.
So I think well, there's quite a lot of information kind of out there about the best ways to deliver social protection for kinship care families. I think first of all, perhaps looking at existing social protection programs that are designed to reach vulnerable families and checking that kinship care families are not being denied access to those existing interventions. And then I think it's maybe thinking if that's providing enough financial support or if they might need additional supports as well. Perhaps having an intervention that's designed, as we've just been talking about, the kinship care grants in New Zealand and South Africa that are specifically designed for kinship carers. And making sure that there isn't kind of discrimination that's not deliberate against kinship care families. For example, they're quite often quite large families, and there might be a cap on the number of children in a household that can receive a child support grant, for example, and they would be discriminated against. And then I think also there's lots of evidence around integrating social protection into wider support and programming. So it's often referred to as cash plus programming, where you have a cash grant, but you also receive some kind of additional service. So that might be referral to social services, or that might be a parenting support program, or some kind of intervention that's designed to change social norms. So that, I think, also, because kinship care families have complex needs, poverty is really key, but there's multiple other needs as well that they have. Sort of linking them into that wider set of programming through social protection can be really valuable. And I also think this kind of sequencing of support is quite interesting as well, and whether you need to provide social protection. Some evidence suggests, it's one of the first things you need to do, because the families can't concentrate or do anything else when they're living in extreme poverty. But other evidence would say, there's issues around dealing with trauma and that, they can't actually bring themselves out of poverty until you've dealt with those issues. So I think there's thinking about how you sequence support is also quite important.
I think in a more supported world, one of the things I'd like to see, in addition to finally addressing this issue of poverty and kinship care, which is massive, I would also like to see services available in the community outside of the child protection system, outside of social care, in the same way as we have services, say, for relationship counselling or domestic violence, that we could have kinship specific services that families could call upon as they needed. One of the big issues someone alluded to earlier, of course, was around contact with the children's parents, which can be quite problematic at times. When families go through family court, so divorce proceedings, and there are services there where some contact centres where contact is very difficult, and there can be some support and monitoring, if necessary, of contact arrangements. I think this is something that's very much needed in the kinship space and outside of child protection. That's something that people can access as and when they need it. Maybe they need it at certain times in the child's life and not other times in the child's life. Or it may be issues around identity that surface in adolescence. A service that the carers and the children could go back to and talk with people who have specific knowledge and experience around kinship care and can help them with those issues.
Thanks, both. There's more questions coming in. So another question here. Also, other children in the family may be affected because of the new arrangements, such as the kinship care arrangement. Do we have programs to work on this? Thank you.
I'd like to think there were. Certainly surfaces from time to time. It can be jealousy. It can be the feeling that the other children aren't getting the attention they used to get before the kinship children arrived. It might be relationships between the children. that can become quite problematic. So I think a family approach is really important rather than one that's sort of focused on a particular child or on the carer.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's when I've been working on developing this global guidance around kinship care, it's one of the areas where we haven't been able to find lots of examples of promising practice, but there's certainly been enough evidence to suggest that there's a need, and also that interventions can inadvertently kind of make the situation worse by perhaps targeting the child in kinship care and giving them more support than the other children in the family, and creating sort of jealousies and tensions. So I think it's a really important area. A good question to explore further, and if anybody has examples, please let me know, because I'd love to be able to include some in the guidance.
Exactly. Yeah, not just reaching out with questions, reaching out with information and examples if you've got, please. Another question that's come in. So in Chile, kinship care is a transitionary measure whilst waiting for the work to be done with the family of origin, with the view to family reunification. Is this the case in the panelist countries?
Yes, I think in Australia this comes up quite a bit, that concern that the work isn't always being done, that the children, the parents of children, I've spoken to a number of parents who had children in kinship care who said that any service they had dropped out once the children were placed, and they felt very, very abandoned. Was as if, well, we've given up on you, we've taken your child and placed them, and now we'll focus on their needs. Yeah, so that work really needs to be done to look at the prospect of unification. Conversely, there's concern about evidence that reunification is slower in kinship care than in foster care. But I think there's an inbuilt assumption that that's a bad thing, and it may well be a bad thing because the work hasn't been done that would enable that family reunification. On the other hand, sometimes it might be the most appropriate thing for the child, that the child actually remains with a family member rather than returning to their parents. So I think we need to look at these dimensions as not simple dimensions about reunification is always better, or placement elsewhere is always better, but actually look at the particular case and what is better for that child.
Yeah, I just would agree with everything Meredith said, but just to say this is another area that we're trying to address in the guidance, and it is certainly different reintegrating a child from a kinship care arrangement than a foster care arrangement or from residential care. So it's a different set of challenges and a different set of support needs, and it links very much into this need to enable and maintain contact where it's in the child's best interest with their parents, and the specific challenges that you have when the carer has a relationship with the parent as well as the child having a relationship with the parents, and they may pull in lots of different directions. So I think kinship, that's an area where probably universally kinship carers need support, and there's quite interesting evidence around parents who've migrated for work, and the child has remained with a grandparent and then been reintegrated back to the parent, and some of the kind of challenges in those situations and contexts are not just in situations where the child has been removed because of issues around trauma. There's also economic reasons or other reasons for separation, which also create challenges around eventual reintegration.
The other thing we looked at in the study that we did on family contact in kinship care is that sometimes with child protection, rules were set that were a bit rigid. You know, this child is to see their parents so many times a month or a week or whatever. But in fact, that things change for the child or the parent over time. So sometimes that arrangement is the appropriate one, and then sometime later it may be that the child needs more contact with the parent. It may be that the child wants less contact. It may be that contact is quite traumatic. And we did find some of the teenagers actually made their own decisions and just defied the requirements by saying, you know, I will not go and see my parent right now. And we've, you know, children shouldn't be put in that situation where they have to do that. those arrangements need to be flexible. It may be, for example, the child wants to go back to their parent for a period of time. That may work out as a permanent arrangement, it may not. So that flexibility to address the needs of the child and the carer and the parent at all the different stages is needed.
Thanks both. I'm conscious of time, but there are a few more comments and questions that are coming in. So there was a comment here reinforcing the need to take note of the carer's trauma as well as that of the child.
Yes.
Which we've spoken to, and I think in the presentation given by Sarah, they had a series that they'd mentioned, which was very much about the bereavement or the loss for the caregiver as much as for the child. So I think that's really speaks to that. There's also been some comments coming from Raul from Brazil. So a thank you to Sarah for their presentation, and he was curious about the kinship care groups. He was thinking about how this experience could be useful for the context of Brazil. So I think that's one we'll share with Sarah, and she can follow up on Changemakers for Children. Meredith, thank you for your presentation. It's useful to know that we have to go deeper into the members of the extended family and their challenges and difficulties, but also the richness of these members as a form of care. And then there's a series, there's a series of questions that have come from Raoul. Now, I wonder if these might be more geared towards Sarah, but we can have a quick look at them as well. How do families in situations of care in informal kinship have access to your work? How is access to their work performed when the parent cannot take care of the child? In the work that you do you also carry out social monitoring for the children's parents? And are there cases in which children return to live with their parents after participating in kinship care programs?
Yeah, I think they're probably quite directed at kinship's work. I don't know, Meredith, if you've got anything. Just
yeah, well, just a couple of comments, I suppose, that I think my focus at the moment is very much around informal kinship care. I think these are families that are hidden and miss out on a lot. And we need to really pay a lot more attention to this group, because they are the majority, and it's a small minority within formal systems that tend to get the attention and to be visible. Certainly children will return to their families after participating in programs like the ones that Kinship run in the UK. And I think we do need to be mindful about when they go back, they still need support, and so do their parents, because their parents are picking up their parenting role again with all the challenges that entails. There may be anger from the child about the time they've been away. They may not know how to relate to each other anymore. This is a time when they need a lot of support. Yeah. Just a comment about the context in Brazil. There is a British social worker who's been living in Brazil for many years, Jonathan Hannay. Have you come across him? I know he's...
No, I think Ram will know him from... Yeah. Ram's from ABC, right? Yeah. Yeah. I think they will have collaborated, yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's all the questions we've got time for, but those that are remaining, I'll post them on the Changemakers for Children site, and we can follow up with responses there and continue the conversation. I just wanted to say thank you, really. Thank you very much to the panelists for making time and for sharing all of your knowledge and learnings, and also to all of those who have attended today. We are going to launch a quick poll, so if you can take time to just answer that quickly before you finish. There's 2 polls, one after another, hopefully. One of them is asking the attendees if there's certain topics or issues that you would find useful for us to cover in this learning series going forward. So please add in a few ideas there. We obviously won't be able to cover all of it, but it's useful to make sure that the learning series that we're running are of value to those attending them. I also wanted to quickly apologise because apparently there were some technical issues with some of the links at the beginning of the webinar. So if you were amongst those who had challenges connecting at the beginning, there will be a recording shared afterwards. So hopefully you'll still be able to access all of the presentations that were shared today. We will be having our next webinar in June, the date of which is still to be finalised, but that will be looking at the role of kinship carers in supporting kinship care, and we'll announce that shortly. So I'll just give everyone a few minutes to just respond to the 2 polls. And we'll also be resharing a link in the chat so that people are able to join the Changemakers platform and get more information about the webinars as they're announced. Thank you very much again, everybody, for joining us today. I hope everyone's found that a really useful and interesting session. I certainly have. And hopefully people will join us again soon for the next one in the series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Meredith. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.